Investigating kinetic energy. In this video, I will review with you what you should have written on pages 10 and 11 if you followed along with the guided slideshow. Okay, let's take a look at the data tables. We investigated two different variables, and when we change a variable, we call that variable the independent variable. And the thing that we measure, in this case, we were measuring the amount of squish, that is the dependent variable. All right, so the first investigation, we were measuring the speed. So the first time we just dropped it, and the second time we added some force, so we increased the speed and made the can go faster. The second time that we did this, we investigated the variable of mass, and we used a cat food can and a dog food can, and then we measured the amount of squish. Our mass was the independent variable, and the amount of squish was our dependent variable. Now, in the slideshow, after you got done collecting your data, I asked you a couple questions, and I helped guide you along the way. So I asked you to write anything that was in purple into your workbook. So let's see how you did. Okay, so the first one I said, in the data table number 1 space, write the following. So when the speed increased, okay, and I said ... And the question says, for the data in each table, describe how the dependent variable changed when you changed the independent variable. So this is our independent variable. So what happened to the dependent variable, or the amount of squish? So when the speed increased, the amount of squish also increased. All right, so that should be what is in your workbook. You might have written, and I'll write this in a different color, you might have written when the speed increased the, oops, that's my highlighter, the kinetic energy increased. Now that's not totally wrong, but what were we measuring? The amount of squish. So kinetic energy is very general, but in this particular investigation, what we were measuring is the amount of squish. For the second data table, I asked you to start the sentence with when the mass increased. And so therefore you should have written when the mass increased, the amount of squish also increased. The should do was circle the independent variable in your sentence. So the independent variable is the thing that we change, and so therefore, if you did that, the answer was mass. For the making sense questions, I asked you to write them in the claim, evidence, reasoning format. To do so, all you had to do was copy the purple sentences and fill in the blanks. Remember that the claim is the answer to a scientific question, and the question we're trying to answer is, does the speed affect the amount of kinetic energy in a moving object? Now, I like to start by writing C and then E and then R, because then I know what I have to fill in. So the first sentence that I asked you to write was this. When speed increased, the amount of kinetic energy blank. So what you should have written in the blank was that when speed increased, then the amount of kinetic energy also increased. Now, your job in the evidence and reasoning is to prove this claim. Tell me something that supports your claim. So you should have written the can that was dropped squished the clay blank millimeters, and the can that was thrown squished the clay blank millimeters. So I'm going to put in some data here for the sake of, let's see, so the can that was dropped, say, was 7 millimeters, and then the can that was thrown in it made it smush or squish 17 millimeters. The reasoning usually states some kind of scientific fact about the experiment. So in this case, we're talking about kinetic energy. So I asked you to fill in the blank for the definition of kinetic energy. So for the reasoning, you should have said kinetic energy is, and then maybe you said energy of motion, period. Since the clay was squished more by the can that was thrown, this proves that faster objects have more kinetic energy. Okay. Now you're going to use the first example as a model to do the second question. This question is very similar. So you are going to answer the question, how does mass affect the amount of kinetic energy in a moving object? So basically what you're doing is rewriting the one that is up here at the top, but this time you're going to talk about the mass. So we're going to talk about, instead of it being dropped and thrown, but this time you're going to talk about the cat food can and the dog food can, or the light and heavy can, and how much they were squished. All right, kinetic energy is going to stay the same. You're still going to use this same sentence, but now you're going to say something different about which can has more kinetic energy. So I will set you up with this, and then you will show this to me when you are done. So off to the side, you're going to want to write a C. Maybe something smaller like this, okay, a C, an E, and an R. And like I said, you are going to use this one up here as your model and write your claim, which is the answer to the question, your evidence, which is your data or the numbers, and your reasoning, which is talking a little bit about kinetic energy and how you know which can had more kinetic energy.